There is a particular kind of quiet that comes before something ends. Not the silence of sleep, or the quiet of a library, or even the hush that falls over a room when someone says something painful. Those silences still have breath in them. You can feel the lungs working, the walls holding, the future moving just underneath the surface. No, I'm talking about a different kind of quiet. The kind that settles into a person's bones when they have already decided, when they've already counted the cost, weighed the math, looked at everything they are against everything the world wants from them, and come up with a number they can't argue with. That's the quiet Sora had. I know because I watched her for 11 minutes before she moved. 11 minutes on the transit platform at Mir 9 Station, upper level, Section G, the kind of place where nobody stands still. Every direction is a departure gate or a customs line or a vendor shouting over the hum of the mag rail. 3,000 people moving through on any given shift rotation. Cargo containers stacked 40 meters high on the east wall. The smell of recycled atmosphere and synth-oil, and whatever the Kelari food vendor 2 stalls down was frying in a pan the size of a hoverpod. And in the middle of all of it, Sora. She was leaning against the railing at the platform edge, not looking at anything specific, not watching the trains, not reading a board. Just standing with her arms loose at her sides and her eyes somewhere below the middle distance, like she was looking at something that wasn't there. I was on my break, eating a terrible wrap from the same vendor. I sat on one of the polymer benches about 30 meters from her, and I watched, not because I thought something was wrong, exactly. More because something about the way she stood didn't belong to the crowd around her. Everyone else was moving with purpose, or moving with frustration, or stopping with the specific energy of someone who's lost and about to ask for directions. She was the only one standing like she had nowhere to be, and had accepted that completely. After about 4 minutes, I noticed the railing. Her left hand was resting on it, not gripping. Just resting, palm down, fingers loose. And every minute or so, one finger would lift and settle back again like she was feeling the edge. Not dramatically, not obviously, just quietly measuring the distance between herself and the drop below. The transit platform at Mir 9, upper level, is 31 meters above the main concourse floor. I finished my wrap. I sat there for another 7 minutes watching the hand. Then I stood up and walked over. That's the whole beginning. 11 minutes, a terrible wrap, and a girl with one hand on a railing. What came after is what I'm here to document. Her name, in the Velthari tongue, was something closer to Saravath Nakalen, which roughly translates to the one who persists in darkness. She'd been called Sora since she was old enough to understand that most beings outside the Velthari compact couldn't manage the full pronunciation without straining something in their jaw. The Velthari are what humans, when they first encountered them 300 years ago, started calling vampires. I want to be careful here because the mythology runs deep and most of it is wrong. They are not undead. They do not dissolve in sunlight, though UV-heavy star systems cause them significant discomfort and eventually cellular damage if exposure is prolonged. They do not sleep in coffins. They do not have the power to transform into animals or control other beings with a glance. What they do have is a biology so different from baseline humanity that the first xenobiologists who cataloged them didn't believe the data for 6 years. They metabolize almost no photonic energy. Their bodies run almost entirely on a compound found in blood, specifically the blood of beings with certain neurological architectures. It's not mystical. It's biochemistry. The compound is called Valleythin. It exists in several species across 4 galaxy sectors, humans among them. They have hollow secondary canine teeth, fangs, if you want to be blunt, that evolved for feeding. Their eyes process light differently than most humanoid species, which makes them seem to glow faintly in low-light conditions. A pale violet that sits somewhere between eerie and beautiful, depending on what you're used to. Their skin runs cold by human standards, Their hearts beat roughly once every 4 seconds, and they can go without feeding for approximately 14 standard days before their cognition begins to deteriorate. They live a long time, centuries if they're careful. Some of the oldest Velthari on record are nearly 800 years old and still functional. Zora was 26, which sounds young until you understand that 26 for a Velthari is something like 17 or 18 in human terms, still finishing the developmental window, still in that specific liminal space between who they were raised to be and who they're deciding to become, still figuring out what they believe about the universe and their place in it. 26, and she had already decided she didn't have one. I know what she was thinking on that platform because she told me later, in pieces, during the 3 conversations we had over the following week. She didn't say it all at once. She wasn't the kind of person who gave you everything up front. She'd give you a thread and then go quiet, and you just have to sit with the thread until she was ready to give you more. Here's what the threads add up to. She had come to Mir 9 Station 6 weeks before I found her. She'd taken a transport from Velthari space. The compact occupies a cluster of 7 systems in the outer Karada arm, politically autonomous and heavily isolationist, which is a polite way of saying they mostly want to be left alone, and humanity mostly obliges because the early attempts at diplomatic contact went badly enough that everyone agreed to step back and breathe. But the borders had opened slightly about 40 years ago. Not wide, just enough for individuals to travel under a special bilateral visa category called the exchange waiver. Educational transfers mostly, cultural liaisons, a handful of researchers on both sides. Zora had gotten an exchange waiver to study xenobiological integration at the Mir 9 Research Annex. She was supposed to be there for 2 years. She was supposed to be building a case for her doctoral designation back home, a project on cross-species nutritional biochemistry, which is essentially a clinical way of saying she was studying how Velthari physiology might adapt to alternative Valithin sources, so they weren't perpetually dependent on finding compatible blood donors. A future-forward study, hopeful even. She got to Mir 9, and something started going wrong from the first week. It wasn't dramatic at first. It started small, the way most collapses do. The research annex had her accommodations in a shared habitat block with 12 other visiting academics, all of them human. She couldn't eat the food in the common dining room, not because it was inadequate, but because the smell of 17 different varieties of human-calibrated nutrition, compounds in a small space, triggered a feeding response she couldn't fully suppress, and suppressing it took so much energy that she'd leave every meal exhausted and vaguely sick. So she stopped going. The light levels in the habitat block were calibrated for human comfort. Slightly UV heavy, the way most interior lighting in human-built stations runs. It didn't burn her, but it created a persistent low-grade discomfort that turned into headaches that turned into days where she couldn't focus on anything longer than 20 minutes without her vision blurring at the edges. She went to the station medical unit. The human doctor on staff was thorough and kind, and admitted, openly, that she was out of her depth with Velthari physiology. She pulled up 3 different xenobiology references and did her best. She adjusted Zora's habitat lighting. She suggested dietary supplements that approximated some of the Valithin compounds. The supplements didn't work well enough. The isolation was what really got her, though. The other visiting academics were friendly in the way people are friendly when they're trying very hard to be inclusive and not quite sure how. They invited her to things, group meals she couldn't attend, social gatherings in the common lounge where the sounds and smells of 20-odd humans in a small space felt like static directly inside her skull. Study sessions she'd show up to and then leave early because she could feel her own oddness like a weight, and she didn't know how to set it down. She wasn't asking for pity. I want to be clear about that. What Zora experienced wasn't anyone's fault exactly. The station wasn't designed for her biology. The people around her weren't equipped to understand what she needed. And she, 26 years old, first time off Velthari space, no model for how to navigate any of this, didn't have the language or the confidence to explain it. She started withdrawing, stopping the invitations, staying in her room during off hours, going to the lab at shift start and coming back at shift end and talking to no one in between unless the research required it. Around week 4, the research started going wrong too. Her data was solid. Her methodology was fine. The problem was a senior researcher named Dr. Harlan Voss, who oversaw the Xenobiology Annex and who had very specific ideas about what the Velthari study program was supposed to produce. He wanted results that would be publishable in human index journals. He wanted language that human academic audiences would find accessible. He kept asking Sora to soften her framing, to translate her conclusions into terms that wouldn't alarm general readers. What he was actually asking was for her to make her people's biology sound less strange, less threatening, less other. She tried. She rewrote 3 sections of her preliminary findings. She softened the language. She removed the parts about feeding response and replaced them with more clinical terminology that meant the same things without the connotations. Then Voss read the revision and said, and these are the words she repeated to me in almost exactly this order. It's better, but I think the committee will still find the fundamental premise uncomfortable. Perhaps we need to reconsider the scope of the project. He wasn't telling her the research was bad. He was telling her the subject, her people, her biology, herself, was inconvenient. She didn't say anything. She thanked him and left his office and went back to her room and sat on the edge of her bed for a long time. That night she pulled up her visa documentation and started reading the repatriation clauses. What it would cost to leave early, what that would mean for her degree program, whether anyone back home would understand why she'd given up. The cost was high. The degree program would be set back by at least 2 years, and back home, she had a mentor who had fought hard to get her this placement, a family who had celebrated her departure like a beginning. Going back early would mean explaining what went wrong, and she didn't have the words for it yet, and she wasn't sure she ever would. She closed the documentation. She told herself she'd figure it out. 2 weeks later, she was standing on the platform railing at upper level G with one hand on the edge. I didn't know any of this when I walked over to her. I just walked over. I almost didn't. I want to be honest about that. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, standing up from the bench with my wrapper in one hand, where I thought about the fact that Velthari social customs around unsolicited contact are different from human ones. More formal, more protocol-heavy. In Velthari space, walking up to a stranger without introduction signals are something between rude and threatening, depending on context. I thought she'll think I'm being aggressive. And then I thought she has her hand on the railing. So I walked over. I came at a slight angle, not directly from behind. Something about coming up behind someone felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate but trusted. I stopped about 2 meters away and said, quietly, because the platform was loud and I didn't want to shout, "Hey." She didn't startle, which surprised me. She just turned her head slowly, like she'd been expecting someone to show up eventually, and looked at me. Up close, her eyes were the pale violet I'd been told about in the xenobiology briefings. Her skin was silver pale, almost luminescent under the platform lighting. She was wearing a gray thermal layer and civilian transit clothes, nothing that marked her as a researcher or a visitor, just clothes. Her hair was dark, cut close on one side, longer on the other. She looked in that specific moment like someone who was very tired. "You've been sitting on that bench for a while," she said. Her standard was precise, better than mine, honestly, watching me. "Yeah," I said, "I was eating a wrap." She looked at the crumpled wrapper in my hand. "That vendor uses synthetic oil," she said, "the kind that tastes like plastic after the second bite." "It really does," I said. "I keep buying it anyway. The first bite is good." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile, more like a small adjustment, like a door that hadn't quite latched suddenly sitting better in its frame. "Why did you come over?" she asked. Not hostile, just direct. I looked at her hand on the railing. She followed my gaze. Then she looked back at me. "I didn't say what I was thinking, which was because I was scared of what you were about to do." That felt like too much weight for the first sentence. Instead, I said, "You looked like someone who could use a different kind of company, even if it's just someone standing nearby." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't really do well with company," she said. "That's okay," I said. "I can stand 2 meters away and we can just share the view." Another pause, then, "The view here is a cargo bay." "It's a big cargo bay." She looked at the cargo bay. I stood 2 meters away and looked at the cargo bay. The magrail hummed somewhere below. A Kalari cargo worker shouted something in the trade dialect at a hovering loader. Somewhere above us, the atmospheric recyclers clicked through a cycle, and the air pressure shifted by about 2 pascals in a way you can feel in your ears if you know what to listen for. After about 3 minutes, she took her hand off the railing. Her name was Sara. She told me that first. We stood near the railing for another 10 minutes. She'd moved a few steps back from it, which I noticed and didn't remark on, and talked about almost nothing. The cargo operation below. The specific design failure of the station's upper transit level, which was supposed to feel airy and open, and instead felt like the inside of a compression chamber because whoever designed it didn't account for echo. How the food vendors on the east side were better than the west side despite being less obvious. Small things, ordinary things. She was testing, I realized later, seeing what kind of person I was before she said anything real, whether I'd push, whether I'd ask the big questions too fast. I didn't, not because I was strategically restraining myself. I genuinely didn't feel the need. Something about standing next to her felt quiet in a way I didn't want to disrupt. Like we'd accidentally built a small pocket of calm in the middle of all that crowd noise, and I didn't want to break it by reaching too hard. Before she left, she asked my name. "Darren," I said. "Akafar. I work for the Interstellar Welfare Bureau, station liaison mostly, a lot of paperwork." She considered this. "You evaluate whether people are being treated adequately," she said. "Not a question, just parsing the job description." "Among other things," I said. She nodded once slowly. Then she said, "I think I need to sleep, but thank you for sharing the view." "Any time," I said. She walked away into the crowd. I watched until I couldn't see her anymore. Then I went back to my desk and pulled up the IWB visitor registration for Mir 9 and started reading. Her file was not good reading. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was the opposite. It was a series of unremarkable check-ins and standard compliance notes that, taken individually, seemed fine. Taken together, they told a story of someone slipping gradually through every safety net the station theoretically had in place without any of the nets noticing. She'd checked in with the exchange waiver office on arrival, standard. She'd completed the xenobiological orientation with the medical unit, standard. She hadn't attended the month 1 welfare check that the Bureau was supposed to conduct for all non-human visitors. The note in the file said, "Meeting scheduled, visitor did not appear, rescheduled." The rescheduled meeting had never happened because the officer who scheduled it had rotated to a different posting and nobody followed up. That was us. That was the Bureau's failure. I sat with that for a while. I found her lab assignment. I cross-referenced with the research annex logs. Her badge tap data showed her coming in at shift start and leaving at shift end, every day, with one exception. She'd stopped accessing the common dining areas entirely at day 23. After that, her nutrition tracker, mandatory for non-human visitors under the exchange waiver, showed no logged meals for 11 consecutive days. 11 days. Someone should have flagged that. Technically, the system was supposed to auto-flag it. I went back through the administrative records and found the flag, buried in a queue that had 847 other items in it, and had been marked as low priority because the system categorized Velthari feeding requirements as non-standard and self-managed, and therefore the 11-day gap triggered a flag instead of an alert. A flag, not an alert. The difference is about 6 levels of urgency and whether a human being actually reads it in real time. Nobody had read it. I sat at my desk for a long time after that. Then I went and found the Xenobiology Annex and knocked on Dr. Harlan Voss's door. The conversation with Voss is not one I'll reproduce in full here. It's in the formal case record. What matters for this account is the shape of it. He was defensive in the way people are defensive when they know they've done something wrong, but haven't admitted it to themselves yet. He said all the right things about inclusion and cross-species collaboration. And then, when I pushed on the specifics of the research redirection, he said something about academic standards and appropriate framing, and the reality of what publication committees respond to. I asked him directly, "Did you tell this researcher to change her findings to make them more palatable to a human audience?" He said, "I advised her on how to communicate her findings more effectively." I said, "Her findings were about Velthari physiology. You advised her to remove the parts that made human readers uncomfortable. That's not communication strategy, that's erasure." He didn't like that word, but he didn't argue with it either. I left his office and filed a preliminary adverse conditions report. Then I went to find Sora. She was in the lab. Late shift, most of the other researchers gone. She was at a terminal in the back corner, the light adjusted down on her side of the room. She'd learned how to request that at least. Her data was up on the screen, and she was reading through it with the focused, slightly rigid posture of someone who's been concentrating for a long time and is keeping themselves going on while alone. I knocked on the doorframe. She looked up. "You work late," she said. "Apparently," I said. "Can I sit down?" She gestured at a chair. I sat. I told her about the nutrition flag that nobody had read. I told her about the welfare check that never got rescheduled. I told her, carefully, that the Bureau had failed to meet its obligations to her, and that I was sorry for that. She listened. She didn't look particularly surprised. She looked like someone who'd already done the math on how much she could expect, and had set the number low enough that this landed without shock. "I'm fine," she said when I finished. "Are you eating?" I asked. "A bit. I have some synthetic Valithin supplements." "Are they working?" Another beat, longer, not very well. I looked at the screen in front of her. Her data. Weeks of research data on alternative Valithin synthesis that she'd been building toward in her study. "Your research," I said. "What would it mean if it worked?" She blinked, like the question had come from an unexpected angle. "If I can map the synthesis pathway accurately," she said slowly, "and cross-reference it with what we know about blood analog production in non-Velthari biology, there's a theoretical basis for a compound that Velthari could produce themselves, or that could be synthesized externally without requiring a biological donor." She paused. "It would mean," she said more quietly, "that we wouldn't have to depend on anyone. We wouldn't be a problem for anyone. We could just exist." She stopped. I said, "That sounds like something worth finishing." She looked at the screen for a moment, then she looked at me. "You're doing the welfare thing," she said, not unkindly, just observing it. "I'm doing the welfare thing," I agreed, "but I also mean it." She was quiet. Then, "Nobody has talked to me about the research in 6 weeks, except Voss, and that was to tell me to change it." "Tell me about it," I said. She studied me for a second, like she was deciding something. Then she turned the screen so I could see it better and started talking. I want to pause here and say something about that moment that I couldn't put in the formal report, because it doesn't translate to bureaucratic language. I am not a xenobiologist. I understood maybe 40% of what she was explaining to me about valine synthesis pathways. The rest of it I followed in the way you follow a story you don't know the language of, by watching the shape of the telling, rather than catching every word. And the shape was extraordinary. She talked about her people's biology with a precision that was also, somehow, deeply tender, like she knew every corner of it, like she'd spent her whole life trying to understand this specific thing, not as a curiosity, not as a problem to be solved, but as herself, her body, her family's bodies, the bodies of everyone she'd grown up with. She talked for almost an hour. She kept stopping and asking if I was following, and I kept saying mostly, and she'd back up and explain the piece I'd missed, and something in the way she did it changed over the course of the hour. She started out careful, measured, like she was delivering a formal presentation. Somewhere around the 40-minute mark, she stopped being careful and just started talking. Faster, with her hands, correcting herself mid-sentence not because she was wrong but because a better word had occurred to her. By the end, the light had shifted. The station was cycling into its dim period, which it does every 22 hours, and the lab was quiet, and she'd said more words to me in one sitting than she'd said to anyone at Mir 9 combined. She stopped, looked around like she'd surfaced from somewhere. "Sorry," she said. I talk a lot when I'm actually talking about something I know." "Don't apologize," I said. I asked. She closed the data screen, looked at her hands. "I almost didn't come back to the lab today," she said, very quietly, not looking at me. I let that sit for a moment. "I'm glad you did," I said. She nodded once small. "So am I," she said, "I think." What happened after that was a process, not a moment. I want to be accurate about that because the story of how Sora came back from the edge of the transit platform isn't a story with one dramatic turn. It's a story with 100 small ones. The Bureau's formal interventions helped. I won't understate that. We got her accommodations changed to a single habitat pod with adjustable light spectrum. We sourced a higher-grade valine analog compound that the medical unit hadn't known was available through the xenobiology supply network. It wasn't perfect, but it was significantly better. We flagged her research project for independent review, which eventually resulted in Voss being asked to step back from oversight of the exchange waiver program pending a procedural review. All of that mattered. It addressed the material conditions that had been grinding her down. But there was something else too, something harder to quantify. I kept coming back to the lab. Not every day. I had a job to do, cases to manage, 40-odd other exchange waiver visitors on the station whose files I was now reviewing with considerably more attention than I had before. But a few times a week I'd stop by the lab during my break, the same time slot where I'd been eating the terrible wrap on the platform bench, and I'd sit in the chair by her terminal, and she'd tell me where the research was. Sometimes I understood it, sometimes I didn't matter. She started asking me questions back. About the Bureau. About how the welfare monitoring system actually worked versus how it was supposed to work. She was interested in the gap, in a forensic kind of way. About Earth, which I'd been to twice and found overwhelming both times. About what I thought about the Keleth Accords, which had just been renegotiated and were in all the feeds. Small things, then larger things. She started eating more regularly once the better compound came in. The dark circles under her eyes, I'd thought they were permanent features. They're not started to fade. She began staying in the lab past shift end sometimes, not because she was hiding from the habitat block, but because she genuinely lost track of time. About 3 weeks after the platform, she attended a small gathering in the common lounge, not the overwhelming 20-person kind, but a quieter one, 6 people, organized by one of the other visiting researchers who'd heard something vague about the situation and wanted to make it less intimidating. She stayed for 40 minutes. She didn't say much, but she stayed. She told me about it the next day. It was fine, she said, with the specific inflection of someone for whom fine is a genuine upgrade. Fine's good, I said. Fine's better than I expected, she corrected. About 5 weeks after the platform, she showed me something in the data. It was late. The lab was empty except for the two of us. She'd been working on a specific section of the synthesis pathway for 3 days straight, and she called me over to the screen without preamble, just, "Come look at this." I came and looked. I won't pretend I understood the specifics. What I understood was the shape of it, a long column of data points on the left, a mapping diagram in the center, and on the right, highlighted in a color that the system defaulted to green, a cluster of results that matched up in a way that, from the expression on her face, was not supposed to happen this cleanly. "Is that," I started. "The synthesis pathway," she said. "Or most of it." She pointed at a gap in the center of the mapping. "There's a section here I still can't close without more data on the intermediate enzyme. But this," she traced the green cluster with one finger, "this holds. I've run it 4 times. She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were doing the thing, the pale violet glow that the orientation docs described as a physiological response to heightened emotional states. She told me once that the Velthari find it embarrassing, like blushing in a visible way you can't control. I told her that it was one of the most striking things I'd ever seen, which was true, and which had made her look at the floor for a moment before acknowledging it. "If I can close that gap," she said, "this could actually be publishable. Not the way Voss wanted, the right way, the full picture." "It will be," I said. "You don't know that." "No," I agreed, "but I'm saying it anyway because it should be." She looked at the screen for a moment. "I was going to leave," she said. "The night you came over on the platform, I wasn't going to go home. I was going to." She stopped. I waited. "I know," I said quietly. "I just want you to know that I know you know," she said, "because you've never said it, and I don't know if that was on purpose or not." "It was on purpose," I said. "Some things are more useful as a shared understanding than as a conversation." She thought about that for a moment. "That's a very Velthari approach," she said. "We tend to prefer things unspoken too." "Maybe that's why it worked," I said. She nodded, looked at the screen again, then she said, "I'm going to finish this." "I know," I said. And she did. Part 1 continues, The Weight of Being Other. I need to step back here and give you more of the world, because the story doesn't make full sense without it. The platform moment, the lab conversations, the incremental recovery, these are the intimate details and they matter. But they're happening inside a larger context, and the larger context is its own kind of story. Mir 9 Station in the year 2387 is one of the largest transit and research hubs in the outer sectors. Built in 3 phases over 60 years, it's essentially a city in space, approximately 340,000 permanent and semi-permanent residents, plus a rotating population of transit passengers and short-term visitors that can push the total above 500,000 on heavy traffic cycles. It's a human-built station, which means its fundamental architecture, lighting, gravity calibration, atmospheric composition, spatial design, food systems, social norms, reflects human biology and human assumptions about what constitutes a comfortable environment. Non-human residents and visitors have always been a significant part of the population, and the station has made various formal commitments to inclusivity and cross-species accommodation over the decades. The reality, as anyone who actually works in welfare monitoring will tell you, is considerably messier than the commitments. This isn't unique to Mir 9. It's a systemic feature of human expansion into multi-species space. Humans built most of the infrastructure. The infrastructure reflects human assumptions. Other species navigate that infrastructure with varying degrees of difficulty, and the systems designed to address that difficulty are chronically underfunded, understaffed, and dependent on individual goodwill in ways that shouldn't require individual goodwill. Sora's situation was not unusual. That is the uncomfortable truth that her case helped me document. In the 6 weeks following the platform incident, I reviewed the files of all 34 non-human exchange waiver visitors currently stationed at Mir 9. Of those, 22 had one or more unresolved accommodation flags in their records. 11 had missed welfare check-ins with no follow-up. 6 had nutrition or metabolic support records showing gaps that should have triggered medical review. None of them had gone as far as Sora, but that's not because their situations weren't serious. It's because the math hadn't added up yet. Give any of those situations another 6 weeks of accumulated stress and isolation and unaddressed need, and the math changes. I filed a comprehensive report. It took 3 months to write properly. It went to the Station Welfare Committee, then to the Sector-Level Bureau Oversight Board, then to a joint commission that included representatives from 8 non-human species with populations on the station. The report is a matter of public record now. I won't reproduce it here. What I'll say is that Sora read a draft of it before I filed it because I asked her to. Not for approval, I told her I was going to file it regardless, but because it was her story partially, and she deserved to know what was being done with it. She read it in my office over about 2 hours. When she finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You put in the part about the nutrition flag." "Yes," I said. "The part about how the system categorized us as self-managing." "Yes." She was quiet again. "Self-managing," she said. "Like a piece of equipment, like something that takes care of its own maintenance and only needs attention when it breaks down completely." "That's what the report says the implicit assumption was," I said. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "Then I want you to add something," she said. She dictated a paragraph, 3 sentences, about halfway through the section on systemic failures, about how the gap between formal policy and actual experience isn't just an administrative problem, it's a signal that the people the policy is supposed to protect weren't actually imagined as fully real by the people who wrote it. That the failure to follow up wasn't negligence in the criminal sense, but something more corrosive. The particular negligence of people who help in the abstract, but can't quite see specific others clearly enough to notice when those others are disappearing. I typed it in exactly as she said it. It's in the report. Several people, at various stages of review, suggested softening that paragraph. I didn't soften it. The galactic political context during this period is worth noting, because it shaped the way Sora's situation was received at various levels, and because it adds a layer to the story that the intimate details alone don't capture. This was a period of significant tension between the human-led Accord states and several of the non-human political compacts, including the Velthari. The tension had multiple sources, but the one most relevant here was the biometric sovereignty debate, a series of diplomatic negotiations around whether non-human species biological data, including the kind of xenobiological research Sora was conducting, could be patented, published, or shared without the explicit consent of the relevant species governing body. The Velthari Compact had been particularly firm on this. Their position, which is not unreasonable when you understand their history, was that their biological characteristics had been studied, speculated about, mythologized, feared, and distorted by human cultural frameworks for 3 centuries, and they were not interested in having their actual biology subject to human-indexed academic publication without meaningful oversight. Voss's request that Sora make her research more palatable to human publication committees wasn't just a personal aesthetic preference. It was, consciously or not, part of a larger pattern, the assumption that Velthari biological data, once inside human-operated research institutions, became subject to human institutional norms. Sora's revised research, published eventually under a joint IWB-Velthari Compact agreement that she spent 8 months negotiating with help from the Bureau's diplomatic liaison, was not just a xenobiology paper. It was a small precedent, the first significant publication under the new biometric consent framework that the Compact had been pushing for. When it came out, it got more attention than she'd expected. Not a lot. Academic papers don't generally go wide in the feeds, but within the specific communities that follow xenobiology policy and Velthari Accord-state relations, it was noticed. She told me about the first response she got from a Velthari academic back home. A researcher she'd admired since she was a student, who'd read the paper and sent her a private communication through the Compact's diplomatic channel. 3 sentences. She didn't tell me what they said exactly, just that the person had used her full name, Saravathna Kalan, and that it meant something specific in that context. "It means they're addressing you as someone with standing," she said. "Someone whose work deserves to be taken seriously in formal terms." She said it without drama, but she was doing the Violetai thing again, and she didn't look away from me the way she usually did when that happened. "I want to talk about something that doesn't appear anywhere in the formal case record, because it happened in a personal rather than a professional context, and I didn't feel it was appropriate to document it officially." About 2 months after the platform incident, Sora asked if she could try something. We were in the lab, late shift. The research was going well. She'd closed the enzyme gap the previous week, and the full synthesis pathway was mapping cleanly, which meant she was in the phase of double-checking and preparing for the writing up stage. She was in a lighter mood than I'd seen her in yet, something close to relaxed. She said, "I want to try something. You can say no. I want you to know that first. You can absolutely say no, and it doesn't mean anything." I said, "Okay. I want to try." There's a Velthari practice for establishing trust with someone who isn't Velthari. It's not ritual exactly. It's more behavioral, social." She paused. "I'm explaining this badly." "You're fine," I said. "Keep going." Among Velthari, when someone extends genuine trust to another person, not polite trust, not professional trust, but the kind that means you're actually letting them see you, the way that's signaled physically is by showing the feeding mechanism. She touched the side of her jaw briefly. "The canines." Extended. I knew from the xenobiology briefings that Velthari typically kept the secondary canines in a retracted position in social settings with non-Velthari, because exposure of feeding anatomy in a human context almost universally triggered a fear response. It was a form of constant social management, a muting of a fundamental biological feature in order to be legible to everyone around them. "It doesn't mean I'm going to," she started. "I know what it means," I said. "It means you trust me." She looked at me for a moment. Then she let her jaw relax slightly, in a way I'd never seen before. A shift in how she was holding herself, like something that was always braced releasing its tension. I'm not going to pretend I had no reaction. I did. A split second of something animal, not fear, exactly, but the distant biological echo of it. The part of human neurology that is very old and responds to certain shapes with a jolt of alertness, regardless of what the thinking brain knows. And then it passed, because it was Sora, because I'd sat in the chair next to her terminal for 2 months, because she'd told me about her research and her family and the mentor back home who'd fought for her placement, and the way Velthari grief customs differ from human ones, and the specific smell of the air in the Velthari system's inhabited planets, which she described once as like cold copper and night-blooming flowers, and which she clearly missed more than she said. Because she was a person I knew. I said, "Thank you." She exhaled long, like she'd been holding something for a long time. "Nobody has ever not flinched," she said. "Not completely." I flinched a little internally, I said. "I know," she said. "I could see it, but you let it pass." "It passed fast," I said. "You're you." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That might be the most useful thing anyone has said to me since I arrived here." The following months, the rest of her 2-year placement, plus a 6-month extension she applied for and received, are in the records. Her research, the publication, the policy negotiations, the gradual shift in her presence on the station from isolated and diminishing to something more like settled, more like someone who had found her footing in a place that hadn't been built for her. She made some friends. Not many. Sara wasn't a many friends person. But she made some, including a Kalari mechanical engineer named Vrath who'd been at the station for 8 years, and who had a similar kind of careful, precise social presence that she apparently found restful, and a human medical researcher named Priya who'd come to Mir 9 specifically to work on cross-species physiological modeling, and who had the specific quality of being interested in things without needing to own them. She taught herself to manage the common lounge in small doses. She figured out which vendors in the transit market sold things she could approximate a Velthari meal with, in a cobbled-together way that she said was about 40% accurate and 70% acceptable if you're not thinking about it too hard. She went back to the platform once. She told me about it afterward. She went there deliberately, on a day when she was feeling solid and clear, and stood at the railing for a few minutes and then walked away. "I wanted to see if it still had the same pull," she said. "Did it?" "No," she said. "It just looked like a railing, 31 meters above a cargo bay." She paused. "I think that's the right way for it to look," she said. Before she left for home, the end of the extended placement, the papers written, the publication navigated, the diplomatic precedent set in however small a way, she came to my office. She had a data cube with her. Small, matte gray, the Velthari standard format for archival storage. "This is a copy of the full research dataset," she said. "Not the published version, the full working version. Every pathway iteration, every failed hypothesis, every notation I made in the margins." She set it on my desk. "I want you to have it, not the bureau, you." I looked at it. "I'm not a xenobiologist," I said. "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm giving it to you." I picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. "The Bureau report," she said. "The paragraph I added. I've been thinking about it since." "The self-managing equipment paragraph," I said. "Yes, I've been thinking about what the opposite of that looks like. What it looks like when someone doesn't treat you as self-managing equipment. When they," she paused, working out the phrasing, "when they show up and stand 2 meters away and share the view of the cargo bay without demanding anything." She looked at the cube in my hand. "I want you to have the full data," she said, "because it represents 2 years of work that I almost didn't finish, and you were part of how it got finished, not in a technical sense. I was going to say in a personal sense, but that still sounds clinical." She tried again. "You took my hand," she said. "Not literally, we'd never actually made physical contact, Velthari contact customs being what they are, and she'd never offered and I'd never assumed. But she meant it in the way she said it. In the way that counts," she added. "You took my hand." I held the cube. "Thank you," I said, "for trusting me with it." She nodded once. At the door she stopped and turned back. "I'll be back," she said. "The research extension I'm writing up at home, if it develops the way I think it might, I'll need access to the Mir 9 facilities again. Probably in about 2 years." "Good," I said. "I'll make sure your accommodation file is pre-adjusted." Something like a smile, not quite but close enough. "And find a different vendor for your break-time meals," she said. "The synthetic oil one really is bad after the first bite." "It really is," I agreed. And she walked out. Final section, what this document is for. I'm writing this down because I was asked to, as part of the Bureau's expanded case documentation initiative for cross-species welfare outcomes. But I'd write it down even if I hadn't been asked, because it's the kind of thing that needs to be on record somewhere. Not the policy failures, those are in the formal report. Not the research outcomes, those are in the published paper and the diplomatic archive. This, the platform, the 11 minutes, the terrible rap, the cargo bay view. The specific texture of how someone comes back from the edge of something. I've worked welfare monitoring for 12 years. I've seen a lot of situations that didn't go the way Sora's did. Some of them were more dramatic, crisis responses, medical interventions, formal escalations. And some of them were more quiet, a person who just faded out, left the station, dropped off the records, and who we never heard from again in either direction. What Sora's situation had that many don't, if I'm honest, is luck. Not my luck. I was just a person eating a bad rap on a bench who happened to be paying attention that day. But the luck of timing, of the platform being there instead of something worse, of the research being in a phase where it could still be salvaged, of a series of small circumstances aligning just right. The systems are supposed to eliminate the need for luck. That's the whole point. You build the nets so that individual luck isn't load-bearing. We hadn't built them right, and we were lucky anyway. The report recommends specific changes: more staffed welfare check-ins with mandatory follow-up, nutrition and metabolic tracking with alert thresholds, actual alerts, not flags, ambient accommodation standards that account for species-specific physiological needs proactively rather than reactively, a restructured research oversight model for exchange waiver visitors that separates academic supervision from welfare monitoring so no single person controls both. Most of those recommendations have been partially implemented as of this writing. Partially. The funding for full implementation is in the current budget proposal. It's been in the last 3 budget proposals. I remain optimistic in a specific, grounded, non-delusional way. What I can say is that the next non-human visitor who arrives at Mir 9 on an exchange waiver will have an automatically scheduled welfare check that cannot be administratively dropped without escalation. That their nutrition tracker will trigger an alert, not a flag, if it goes dark for more than 5 days. That their accommodation pod will have species-appropriate lighting preset rather than requiring a formal accommodation request. Small things. But small things accumulated correctly mean the math doesn't add up the same way. I got a communication from Sora 4 months after she left. Not through bureau channels, through the personal contact address I'd given her in case she needed anything bureaucratically post-departure. It was 3 sentences. She'd submitted the extended research proposal to the Velthari Compact's Academic Council. They'd approved it. She'd be returning to Mir 9 in approximately 22 months for a 3rd-year residency. Below that, a note that wasn't about the research. The Valleythin compound synthesis paper has been cited 11 times in the 2 months since publication. 7 of those citations are from Velthari researchers who were previously unpublished in any human-accessible journal. I thought you would find that meaningful. I did. I wrote back. 11 times in 2 months is a strong start. Looking forward to the 22 months. I'll source better food options for the break time bench. She replied, the cargo bay view is still the same. I replied, still the same. She replied, good. That was the whole exchange. 3 messages, efficient, precise. Very Velthari. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes before something begins. It's not the same as the quiet that comes before something ends. The ending quiet is still, heavy, turned inward. It lives in the bones of someone who has already made a decision and is just waiting for the moment to arrive. The beginning quiet is different. It moves. It has a current running underneath it. It's the quiet of standing on a platform, not with your hand on the railing, but with your feet solid under you, watching the cargo operation below. Aware of the magnitude of everything moving in every direction, aware of your own smallness in the middle of it, and choosing, actively, consciously, with full knowledge of how hard it's going to be to stay. I don't know what Sarah was thinking on that platform before I walked over. I know what she told me later, but I wasn't inside her head in those 11 minutes, and I won't pretend I was. What I know is what happened after. The threads, the pieces, the lab, the data, the unspoken understanding. The one deliberate return visit to the railing to find that it was just a railing. She expected everything to end. And then someone stood 2 meters away and shared the view of a cargo bay, and the math shifted, just barely, just enough. That's the whole story. It doesn't have a more elegant shape than that. Life rarely does.